Welcome, explorers of the world's great mysteries. I'm Doug Kenyon, editor and publisher of Atlantis Rising magazine. We call this program simply Conversations, and we feature the many great contributors to our publication, world-class researchers who dare to follow the real evidence where it leads and let the chips fall where they may. In just a moment, we'll be talking to prolific author and expert on Atlantis lore, Frank Joseph, about exciting new discoveries in the Azores and elsewhere. But first, for those of you unfamiliar with Atlantis Rising magazine, let me introduce you to our publication. Focusing on ancient mysteries, unexplained anomalies, and future science, Atlantis Rising has for many years provided a serious forum for alternative ideas of prehistory, science, and culture, ideas which, when not entirely ignored by the mainstream press, are yet seldom treated with the respect they deserve. Our magazine appears bi-monthly in printed form, and you can find it on stands in most major chain bookstores, such as Barnes & Noble, Hastings, Books A Million, etc. And it's also available from many New Age outlets and independent stores. If your favorite magazine dealer doesn't carry it, ask why. For iPad users, our free app can be found at the Apple App Store. Postal subscriptions are also available worldwide, and you can get it in PDF form on an issue-by-issue basis directly from our website at atlantisrising.com. Among the many great articles in our May-June 2014 issue is an eye-opening story by investigative reporter Patrick Marsalek. It's called Lost Tribes, and it's about the enduring search for the lost heirs of the biblical Jacob. Some of the latest research, including state-of-the-art DNA tracking, may startle you. And then there is Morphic Fields and DNA by William Stecker, Why Life on Earth is Not Explained by Genetics Alone. In Challenging the Illusion of Death, Cynthia Logan has a game-changing conversation with top biologist Robert Lanza. And in Pathological Skepticism, leading psychiatrist Dr. D.W. Krieger explains why some minds will never open. And you'll also find a very exciting piece by our current guest. Frank Joseph is a leading investigator of ancient mysteries. He's also the editor-in-chief of Ancient American magazine. He's an author of many books, including Lost Colonies of Ancient America, Before Atlantis, The Destruction of Atlantis, The Lost Civilization of Lemuria, Survivors of Atlantis, The Lost Treasure of King Juba, and other books. He lives in Minnesota. His website is ancientamerican.com. Welcome, Frank, to Atlantis Rising Conversations.
Thank you so much, Doug. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, you know, in the May-June issue of Atlantis Rising, in your article, Atlantis in the Azores, ? You wonder if a newly discovered underwater pyramid could resurrect an old hypothesis, namely the idea that the Azores could be the site that Plato had in mind for his Atlantis story. Could you tell us what's going on here?
Well, what's very interesting is that less than a year ago, there was a veterinarian who was piloting his own boat from Lisbon back to his home in the Azores Islands. And he was rather casually just examining the sea bottom, as many sailors do, with his side scan sonar. And he happened to pass over an area about less than 100 miles out from his homeland, excuse me, when a strange image floated over the screen. It appeared to be a very geometrically uniform and symmetrical figure that resembled a kind of a square. So he went back over it again. He first of all, he lost the target, and then in a short time refound it again, and did a finer scan on it, and was able to tell that this was a almost unquestionably a man-made figure of some kind, completely different from all of the other topography on the bottom of the ocean at that point.
Where was this exactly?
Pardon me?
Where was this exactly that he found this? Or
we don't know exactly, because he has only shared that information apparently with the Portuguese authorities. He's concerned that someone, because the structure is not particularly very deep. Apparently, it's about 100 feet deep. So a free diver could go down there and perhaps do something to it. It might be possible an old ruin, and therefore would be in a position where it might be vulnerable. So he has not declared its exact position to the public, but we do know that it's about 100 miles off the main Azore island of Santa Maria. And it was there that he found what he claims is closely resembles a pyramidal shape. Now, he did share this information with the Portuguese authorities, who supposedly dispatched a research vessel from the Portuguese Navy. But I've been trying to verify this, as others like Graham Hancock have. And the Portuguese are really playing their cards close to their chest. They're releasing very little information. They're not saying whether it is natural or man-made or anything about it at all. Unfortunately, that's pretty much where it stands. However, I should mention something kind of interesting. Back in 1949, which is quite a long time ago, the very first sonar search of the ocean bottom was conducted by Dr. Maurice Ewing for the National Geographic. And during that time, Dr. Ewing scanned this exact same area that this veterinarian had passed over. And he was in an area called the Hirondelle Deep. The Hirondelle Deep is a pretty, as the name indicates, it's abyssal plain, so it's pretty far down there, but it has some higher areas in it. And in the center of this Hirondelle Deep that was scanned for the first time sonar by Dr. Ewing, he found what he said, actually it was a new discovery. He found a sunken volcanic island. And he was able to retrieve samples of granite from this sunken volcanic island. And he was able to determine that this structure, this natural structure, had collapsed into the Hirondelle Deep within the last 10,000 years. Couldn't get it any more specific than that, but that's geologically, that's extremely recently.
Pretty close to Plato's dates there too, huh?
It is. It's really interesting. Of course, now that 10,000 years could have been far more recent. For example, we know that there are a number of seamounts not too far from this same area. A seamount is basically a mountain that is underwater. This particular seamount, though, that I'm referring to, is called Mount Ampere. And Mount Ampere, which is only, let's say, not even 200 miles from where this site supposedly was discovered, that Mount Ampere is so shallow, and it's a massive mountain, that if you were to dial back in time, say just after the last ice age, when sea levels are known to be much lower than they are now, that this would have been a massive island standing above sea level. We know that because beach sand, erosional beach sand, has been found on the summit of Mount Ampere. There is a place that really needs to be investigated. So I think this entire area really refers to Atlantis. I don't think you can say that this, even if it turns out to be an artificial feature, a real pyramid underwater, which it very well could be, this, I think, is part of the Atlantean polity, as it were. I think that the Atlanteans, as described by Plato, were an imperialistic people, and they colonized large, vast areas of the Atlantic, and they made their homeland, I think, across these islands and large land masses, some of which no longer exist. As far as pyramids on the Azores themselves, that's particularly interesting because only within the last, I would say, less than 7 years now, pyramidal structures, ruinous pyramidal structures, small ones, have been found on various of the Azore Islands. And there's an entire study being made of them right now. So there's a kind of continuity from the land to the water. Unfortunately, like I say, the authorities are not sharing whatever they found out, if they have found out anything.
Well, in a bit, we can talk a little bit more about connecting it more exactly with Plato's story. But I couldn't help thinking that right now, if we can digress a little bit, the movie Noah is apparently very hot right now. And it's not to say neither one of us have seen it, because I asked you before. But the point is that I wanted to get to, a lot of people think that the story of Noah is actually another version of the Atlantis story. The story of, an ancient destruction by flood and the survival thereof. And I was wondering, well, what do you think of the biblical, do you think the biblical Noah story is actually the story of Atlantis?
Well,
Or
we have
what
to.
do you think?
Oh, yes. Well, I think we have to understand that the writers of the Bible, the ancient Hebrews, were a Mosaic people. What that means as a Mosaic people, and they describe themselves, even modern day Hebrew scholars describe themselves as this, they took bits and pieces of other cultures and welded it as part of their own. And the biblical story of Noah and the flood is easily traced back to Sumerian sources. So it's more
Gilgamesh.
than, right, the story of Gilgamesh and Ushnapitin. The story goes back, of course, most recently to Babylon, and we do know about, of course, the captivity that is referred to when the Jews lost Jerusalem and the Ark of the Covenant was lost and all that, that they were in the Babylonian captivity. They were there for a long time, for over 100 years. And a lot of them became prominent citizens after time in Babylon. So there's no doubt that they picked up this story of the flood from the Babylonian version of Upnashpatin. And the Babylonian story was itself taken from the Sumerian story. So you can see the genealogy of at least the Near Eastern or Middle Eastern account directly from Sumerian sources. And they go back really far. The Bible goes back, the biblical story goes back, maybe about 2,500, 600 years ago. But the story of Gilgamesh, that goes back to the 4th millennium BC. So we go far back. But it's interesting that this film is being made. I think it's part of the cultural amnesia that has been really afflicting our species since the loss of Atlantis.
You mean the awakening from the amnesia?
It's exactly, and that I think is so great about. I've always admired the title that you chose for the magazine, Atlantis Rising. That means that I've always felt that meant that this Atlantean consciousness is rising in the general collective unconsciousness of mankind, because it was such a high point that we reached. I think at that time with Atlantis, the culmination of both of our souls, as it were, our technological soul and our spiritual soul. It was a great moment in history, but we lost it. We made a mistake, and we self-destructed it. And the parallels between that event and what is happening now in the world, I think, are so close that things like the Noah movie and so forth, and certainly our wonderful magazine, are related to this general awakening that's happening. It's kind of like a remembrance, connection with the past.
Tapping into an archetype there. Well, do you think that, flood myths, like you mentioned Gilgamesh and the others, are certainly common all over the world? And you're one of the people who has talked about this a lot, recounting many of the stories in on both sides of the Atlantic. And would you expand on that a little bit? I'm thinking about Aslan and some of the American stories that relate to this theme.
Well, it is rather remarkable, isn't it, that around the world, virtually every people have a flood tradition. And, of course, scholars have been puzzled by this for many, many years. And some of the conclusions are, like Joseph Campbell said, well, this is just a kind of, again, archetype of the word that you chose. This is for water and dissolution and so on. They tried to explain it in psychological terms. There might be some basis of fact in some of it.
It could be both.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. I think it could be both. It relates to this cultural amnesia that we discussed earlier. But what I find particularly interesting, when you go and you study these myths up close, as I've been doing now for over 30 years, going on 40 years now, the interesting thing is when you just take a close examination of these myths, whether they're highly sophisticated story with Plato in ancient Greece or amongst the Native American tribal peoples here, there are certain common denominators that go far beyond a mere psychological study. What I mean by that is the basic theme of all of these myths are that at one time there was a high civilization in the Atlantic. They don't specify exactly where or when, but it's almost always the same story that there was once a virtuous, powerful, spiritually alert culture that flourished and dominated the world somewhere in the Atlantic, that these people somehow committed a grievous sin or series of sins and self-destructed. When that happened, the survivors migrated to other parts of the world and created different cultures. You find that everywhere. I can show you the Menominee story of the flood, and the Egyptian version under Manetho, and the Chinese versions or the Japanese version, the Hindu versions. Naturally, they all have different names. The stories vary quite a bit, but the essentials are always there, that there was some big mistake that was made, and that the punishment of the gods fell on this culture because they had risen so high and were so good, but had made these terrible errors. Now, I find that goes far beyond just some psychological explanations. It's certainly far beyond any coincidence. These myths and stories, by the way, are not fables. They are taken very seriously by the peoples who preserved these stories. You must understand that most of these peoples were non-literate. They didn't have the capacity at one time in their past to write these things down. So they had to enshrine those folk myths, or memories rather, that were so important to them in myth, in story. That's what kept these things going through so many generations. Things can be lost, papyrus can be burned, even things written in stone can crumble. But there really is no greater preservation, I think, than a myth that has wound itself around the heartstrings of a people. And this is certainly what the Druids believed, who were actually against the idea of writing things down. Instead, they believed in the cultivation of the human memory, and to some extent, these other peoples have. So I think that the story of the myth of the Great Flood, yes, as you said, definitely appertains to the loss of this high culture, which the Greeks called Atlantis.
Well, now, it's commonly said in Orthodox thinking that we owe the Atlantis story to Plato, and before Plato, there were no others. So, but aside from the indigenous stories that you refer to, how about scholars, historians that go back further than Plato that may have pointed in this direction? I know you've
mentioned...
Well,
see, when skeptics say things like that, it just shows an incredibly sloppy scholarship, because there were numerous Greek scholars before Atlantis who, many of these scholars admit, did have Atlantis accounts. Plato is unique only because he didn't invent this story, as he himself says in the Timaeus, the first dialogue that discusses it. This had been passed down to him from Solon, the great Athenian legislator of the 6th century BC. But what's interesting is that even Plato's account is not complete. We don't have the whole thing. We have more of it than others. Well, you can go back, for example, to ancient Greece, and in the Book of the Dead, they refer to their great island as Atalante. Well, that's the Egyptian name of it. These are nothing more than cultural inflections on the same thing. The Greeks themselves, I'm thinking of Arstrodorus, who lived 150 years before Plato. Arstrodorus had a manuscript simply called Atlantis. That's recognized, but it isn't discussed. Mostly the opponents of Atlantis are interested only in dismissing it without really having any kind of a dialogue about it. I would be excited about having a dialogue with any of these skeptics, but they never discuss it because they can't. They just have nothing to stand on. If you really examine these stories more closely, you see they are rooted very deeply in these peoples that preserved them.
I was thinking about Atlas, the name Atlas and Atlantis.
Well, the name Atlas is a very unusual name. It's a non-Greek name. The word atal, it comes from the Sanskrit to support or to hold up. Interestingly enough, of all of the gods or deities in the Greek pantheon, the two that have non-Greek pedigrees are Atlas and Poseidon. Poseidon also has been very troubling to paleolinguists over the centuries because it apparently is a a Sanskrit word of some kind, but not entirely Greek. But the name Atlas means to support or to hold up. And that relates to the concept of Mount Atlas. Mount Atlas was viewed as supporting the sky. This is, I can testify this to myself, when I first visited Tenerife and the Canary Islands on board ship, you could see this great mountain of Tenerife, of Mount Teide rather, and it was low cloud cover at the time. So it looked as though the mountain was really holding up the sky. Also, Athol or Atlas means to support, as the sea does. The sea supports those objects which can float.
And you
So
find,
it's a
I was about to say, you find those same letters in America. I'm thinking of Aztlan.
Well, Aztlan is one, but if you go to the Aztec calendar, you can see that the glyph for the flood is referred to as Atl, A-T-L, same thing. But Aztlan is interesting, because, as you mentioned, because when the Aztec people had been conquered, the Spanish friars were collecting all their myths in order to better to debunk them, they thought, to convert them to Christianity. And they were told that by the Aztecs, who really called themselves the Tenoche, that the Aztecs were a people who came from an island called the Island of White Daylight, was out in the Atlantic Ocean, and it was called Aztlan, A-Z-T-L-A-N. The name for Aztlan, the direct name means the field of reeds, R-E-E-D-S. And the reason they called it Aztlan, or the field of reeds, was a metaphor for its great wisdom, because a reed was used as an ink pen by the Aztecs. They would break off reeds, dip it into a pigment, and write with it. So if you had mastery over a reed, you were a wise person. Here's a whole field of reeds called Aztlan. Now, it's interesting, on the other side of the world, Manetho, the Egyptian historian that I mentioned earlier, who lived about 300 years before Christ, in Manetho's works, much of it survives, not all of it does, he talks about the origins of the Egyptian people. And he says they came from a place called Sekret Aru, which was this island that began to sink, and that the people, the survivors of it, left and came to the Nile Delta and created civilization there. And the name Sekret Aru means field of reeds. And reed was used for the same reason in ancient Egypt as it was used amongst the Aztecs. It was a sign of literacy. So here you have two totally different, unrelated peoples on opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean, both referring to a sunken homeland, which they both called the field of reeds. Well, this is something that scholars just choose to ignore, but it's just one of thousands upon thousands of parallels between the ancient old world in Europe and the pre-Columbian America.
Well, how literally should we take Plato? Because certainly there's been a lot of debate about whether or not the numbers, the dating that he used and so forth may have actually, we should reduce it by a factor of 10, or the size of the Atlantean continent versus Libya, for example. And I know I've heard many say that, well, actually, the Greeks were very precise and very accurate, and to try to parse it the way we do currently is totally inappropriate.
Well, it's a very controversial point that you bring up. It's probably the most contentious of all amongst Atlantologists. There are supporters and skeptics. I would say that as a whole, and I have studied and restudied and annotated and virtually memorized the Timaeus and the Critias, as my colleagues have, and we regard the body of the text as being extremely accurate, no exaggeration. And one of my finest colleagues, Ken Carrolley in Florida, has pointed out, and he's got some other, I think, credible contemporaneous information that suggests this, that really Plato's account is a spy's report. It reads like a spy's report, that a Greek spy went to Atlantis and was able to bring back this information. I can just tell you in passing why we think so. There's a real heavy emphasis in Plato's account on the military deposition of Atlantis. We have precise information on the number of people involved in the army and the navy, the number of ships. They don't just say, oh, great fleets of ships. boy, they have an accounting. It's like a bureaucrat's accounting, the breakdown of its military. It's very possible, and I am inclined to think that Plato's account was really based on a Greek spy's report. Somebody was actually there. If that's the case, boy, it's really accurate. Now, as regards time and so forth, the Greeks seem to have had numerous ways of measuring time, and this really wasn't confined only to Greece. They were working with several different calendars simultaneously, 5 that are known. There's royal calendars, there's sidereal calendars, lunar calendars, solar calendars, and it's really rough to understand what Plato means when he says, oh, this happened 9,000 years before his time. Are we to take this literally in our calendars today, that this was about 9,400 or 500 years before Christ? Or are we to look at this in sidereal years? It's a problem.
It does square very nicely with the end of the last ice age.
It does and it doesn't. It does to the extent that, yes, at the end of the last ice age, there was massive flooding going on. This Mount Ampere that I mentioned earlier was submerged underwater. Before then, it was a large island. But the problem is Plato's description of Atlantis is identifiably a Bronze Age civilization. The way he talks about the citadel, the interest in the Atlanteans in copper, all this defines not a Neolithic people or even an earlier Neolithic people, an Ice Age people. It defines definitely a Bronze Age people. And therefore, I have come to believe, I don't insist on this, I've been wrong before, I could be wrong again, but I conclude that in fact Plato is talking about lunar years. There's another reason why I think so. The story of Atlantis, supposedly, or at least partially, came from Egypt. That's the account that we have, that Solon went to Egypt, and that the priest of the temple of the goddess Neith at Cayce told them the story. If that's the case, then the spy that was there in Atlantis was probably Egyptian, not Greek. In any case, we do know that the priests who were in control of the temple of Neith, where the story of Atlantis was enshrined, they operated a lunar calendar. They did not talk in terms of solar years. So it's conceivable, again, this is speculation, there's no proof of this, it's conceivable that the priests, when they were telling the story to Solon of Atlantis, when they said that these things happened 9,000 years before, they were talking about 9,000 lunar years. That's a possibility. And as I say, the Bronze Age character of Atlantis, as described in the Timaeus and the Critias, kind of makes me think that that's what was going on.
Now, I've heard you criticize the Thera story, or the idea that Atlantis is in the Mediterranean. What's wrong with that idea?
Everything. We could have a long and rather dismal interview about that theory, which is pretty much in decline now. It was touted very strongly for a long while when they found that the island of Thera, which was sort of a headquarters for the great Minoan civilization, that this magnificent island culture suffered a natural catastrophe sometime in the late Bronze Age, when the entire island exploded, being volcanic, and collapsed into the sea. So people immediately thought, especially the skeptics of Atlantis, thought, this is Plato's story. He got it all balled up, and he just fashioned this his fantasy based roughly on this event that took place. And they were convinced that this took place about 1500 BC. That's when it happened. Well, all of the geologic dating now shows that it did not take place in 1500 BC. That would have been important if it did, because in 1500 BC, the Minoan civilization pretty well winked out of existence. It stopped. Well, as it turns out that the explosion of Thera did not take place then. Instead, it took place, now we know for sure exactly when it took place, in 1628 BC. Well, what happened was Minoan civilization, we now know, flourished reached its zenith culturally after the destruction of Thera. So that doesn't wash with this great event now wiping out a civilization. The Minoans bounced back from that, and
Of
they went through
course,
their golden age.
the Egyptian civilization, which was telling the story to Solon, was advanced far beyond any Minoan civilization, and it seems unlikely they would have referred to it in such uh, respectful terms.
Well, of course. And the Egyptians and the Minoans had a very excellent relationship always. Really great trading agreement, cultural agreements going back and forth. And there's no way that the Egyptians would have confused Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean with Thera in the Aegean. I mean, that's preposterous. But the story of Atlantis in relationship to Thera was just used by attempted debunkers. That's all. And it's still used to a small extent, but not the way it used to. I used to get pretty hot about that when people were constantly bringing up Thera. Oh, that's got to be Atlantis. But and if you look into the details of the civilizations as described by Plato and the detail of Minoan civilization, they bear very little in common with each other. And I don't mean just by their geological locations, or geographical locations, but their differences are profound, and you can't really link them up at all. Now, this isn't to say that the Minoans may very early in their cultural development may not have been influenced by Atlantis, which was the leading cultural power of its time, but the two are not synonymous.
Well, do you think it's possible that any lost civilization could have been technically advanced in terms that would, in modern terms?
I have no doubt that it was. What we do know about the Atlanteans, and just in very conventional terms, already describes them as a highly advanced people. What I'm referring to, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is their metallurgy. They were the ones who invented the Bronze Age, for gosh sakes, by able to combine high quality, high grade copper with tin and zinc. Well, nobody else had done that. Well, that's one indication. To take this a little bit further, the Menominee Indians of upper Wisconsin, who share traditions of what they call the sea people or the marine men, were these light-skinned foreigners, according to them, who arrived in the very ancient past, and they extracted Mother Earth's shiny bones. Well, this is, of course, a metaphor analogous for copper mining. We do know there was a huge copper mining enterprise that took place in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan between 3100 BC, about that time, and 1200 BC. A phenomenal, a staggering amount of the world's highest grade copper was removed in sophisticated mining techniques. So this alone would indicate a culture that was in possession of a technology far beyond anything anybody else had at that time. There's been stories, of course, more than stories, I mean, accounts by Plato that these people even mastered flight and all kinds of technologies that are just coming into our understanding today. Now, of course, people have used this, critics again have used this to poo-poo Cayce and all of the people who believe in such things. But unfortunately, Cayce, for them, Cayce has been proved correct in a great many cases. And
Well, I was going to ask you about Cayce and what you thought of his material on Atlantis, and how do you tie it to how do you connect it to the Plato story?
Well, I think that there is no contradiction between Cayce and Plato. The whole story of Atlantis is so huge. The culture itself was an international, a global culture that lasted for millennia, not just for decades. And they're looking at different parts of the same phenomena. I think that Plato is looking at the very last gasp, the very end of it, where Cayce looks at not the beginning so much, but after the beginning, certainly in its earlier phases.
You do know.
I think that, yes,
well,
go ahead.
I was just saying, you do know that recent research by Greg Little and others indicates the presence of above land development in the Bahamas. And I'm not talking about the J Road. I'm talking about beyond that, but going back again to the end of the last ice age, going back possibly as much as as the 10,000 years we were talking about.
Well, we have something like Göbekli Tepe now, which is
Right.
astounding. That's such a place. I mean, that even blew my socks off. I couldn't imagine that such a highly advanced culture was flourishing that long ago. So I think
We
that,
should just review basically for people, so for if they aren't familiar with some of these names we're talking about.
oh,
Göbekli Tepe, a recent discovery in Turkey, going back probably to at least 10,000 years, maybe earlier. And of course, we were talking about Edgar Cayce, and it's worth mentioning that he was the sleeping prophet who gave us a lot of detail about in his readings about Atlantis, and for which there has been significant archaeological research in the last 30, 40 years. Anyway, just a just a little note there to catch people up on some of this.
no, I think you're right to do that. It's good to keep it clear in the minds of our listeners just exactly what we're talking about. I think that if you read Edgar Cayce's work, eventually you get the feeling that he was seeing things. There's no way this man could have falsified or made up so many incredible details. I'll give you an example of that. He was telling this one person about some very small detail about Atlantis back in the 1920s. And he never mentioned that detail again. I mean, throughout the 20s and the 30s. It wasn't towards the end of his life in the early 1940s that in another reading, Cayce brought up this exact same detail. I think that's remarkable that something like that would have resurfaced after the passage of so much time. It's things like that that give you the feeling, a ring of truth associated with the Cayce readings. More specifically than that, one of the statements he made, an incredible statement, an unbelievable one, was at one time the Nile River flowed into the Atlantic Ocean by Morocco. Well, that seemed, in the context of the times in the 1930s, utterly ridiculous. Such a thing had never happened. Cayce died in 1945, I believe, something like that. And it wasn't until 1994 that a Landsat survey done of North Africa found that the Nile River at one time diverted itself straight across what is now the Sahara and emptied out not far from Casablanca. So I think that things like that are just so heartening for people like ourselves who believe that Cayce had something to say and did in fact see things that nobody else did.
Well, of course, Cayce went a long way in describing the technology of Egypt and all kinds of things like that are unfamiliar to us now, like the giant crystals and other kinds of things, and that are we have no parallel to these days. And he points that that's the reason he says that Atlantis went down, the misuse of these things.
That's right. He says, in effect, that technology is wonderful, it's very admirable, and that technology makes a wonderful servant, but a very cruel god. And that is the lesson that comes out of Atlantis, that the Atlanteans were a very great people. They were very virtuous people. They applied their wealth in creative ways. They lasted a long time. But at some indefinable point, they began to feel that their technology was so powerful that they could do anything with it whatsoever, that they could contravene the laws of nature, that they didn't have to live according to virtuous policies any longer, and they could literally live willfully. They could do anything. Any mistake they made could be corrected. Any sin they made could be redeemed through technology. And it was at that point where their technology was their downfall. Specifically, they began using, according to Cayce, their technology in their mining techniques. This was the basis of their wealth, was their huge capacity to mine tons and tons of the world's highest grade copper, which they sold to the rest of the world. And in using their mining techniques, they created an imbalance in nature and destroyed themselves. That makes a lot of sense, because when you look at where Atlantis probably is or was, it's close to something called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is the most geologically unstable area of the entire planet. More earthquakes, or they're known as seaquakes, of course, at the bottom of the ocean take place there than any other place in the world, even more than the Ring of Fire. And so by causing some kind of a geological disturbance in that part of the world, indeed, you could cause a huge, horrible natural catastrophe. And I believe that's what happened.
Do you think do you see a connection between the copper that you referred to and auriculum that Plato spoke of as being the dominantly used metal of Atlantis?
There's no doubt about that. Plato is, I believe it's pronounced aurichalcum. Perhaps your pronunciation is more correct than mine.
Hey, I only know it from reading.
Oh, well.
Not from hearing it spoken.
Uh-huh. Well, I've tried to break it down as best I can, and I've contacted scholars in ancient Greek. And I've been led to believe that the pronunciation is aurichalcum, and it just literally means bright metal, and it refers to a very high-grade copper. Plato himself refers to aurichalcum as that which was once abundant but is no longer abundant. Well, that makes sense, because aurichalcum could have only come from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. That is where the world's highest grade copper exists. It doesn't exist anywhere to the same degree that it does in the Upper Peninsula. And that's where all this great mining enterprise took place by these sea people or marine men that the Menominee Indians still talk about. So yes, this aurichalcum was this high-grade copper. That was the basis for Atlantean wealth.
Now, you're one of the people who sees a lot of evidence for ancient civilization in America, which I presume you see as part of the Atlantean empire. And your magazine, of course, is devoted to a lot of that. Could you kind of expand on that a bit for us?
Well, I think that the oceans of the world were never barriers to mankind, but as Dr. Thor Heyerdahl used to say, that the oceans of the world were, in fact, superhighways that conveyed people from one part of the world to the other. When you understand that a people as great as the ancient Egyptians, who could have raised this incomparable structure called the Great Pyramid, they certainly were culturally and technologically able to create a fleet of ships that could take them across the ocean, which would be a far lesser achievement, actually, than the Great Pyramid. And I believe that the oceans of the world, in fact, have been these highways that have connected peoples long before Columbus. This does not denigrate Columbus's achievement, which was profound. The more I learn, actually, about the great impact made on our country by other cultures over the past, the greater my respect for Columbus. Because we have to understand that with the fall of the ancient world, when Rome fell, what happened was civilization was non-existent. There were 500 years of dark ages in which all the high achievements of the past were lost and reduced to scraps of legends. And that's all that Columbus had to go on when it was his turn to cross the Atlantic. He may not have been the first to arrive in the Americas, but he was the first to publicly connect the the old world with the new, and that was a tremendous achievement. But those that preceded him included the Atlanteans. And one of the greatest proofs for that, aside from this magnificent copper mining enterprise, which I've discussed at some length in my books, is a place called Poverty Point in the northeastern part of Louisiana. Poverty Point is the oldest city in the United States. People think, well, the oldest city has got to be in Florida, St. Petersburg, but it isn't.
You meant St. Augustine, right?
I'm sorry, St. Augustine. That's correct. My little noodle gets so twisted around sometimes. I need help from people like you to straighten me out.
I'm seldom able to be the helper in this case.
Oh, very much so, Doug, very much. I've really been so grateful over the years you've allowed me and so many others to get this fabulous information out to the general public through our marvelous magazine.
Well, thanks.
But Poverty Point is the oldest city in the United States, oldest city in North America, north of the Rio Grande. And it was founded 1,500 years before Christ. It's almost a duplicate of Plato's description of Atlantis. It's composed of alternating rings of land and water. There originally was water in these moats that separate these land rings. And its time period coincides at least with the lunar understanding of Atlantis. 1500 BC, that was really the middle point of the Bronze Age. was typified by major migration patterns. And then 1200 BC, which would be the end of the Bronze Age in Europe, that's when Poverty Point experienced a major population upsurge. Now, this is, of course, according to mainstream scholars now. This is not my own work there. And so I believe that the Atlanteans established an important colonial city, a capital, in upper Louisiana, which at that time was the focal point of the major river systems in that area. The Arkansas and the Mississippi River were connected right through Poverty Point. The Arkansas River has since changed its course over the last 3,500 years, but back then it was this great, marvelous city. And some of the things that have been found in Poverty Point sound very Atlantean. If you go to the museum there, it's a marvelous museum. They have a barrel, literally a barrel, filled with little crystal owls, effigies shaped into the image of owls out of quartz crystal. That sounds very Atlantean to those of us who have looked into this for so many years. And it's an unusual thing to have found in this marvelous city.
So, what do you think of the pyramids on both sides of it, the Atlantic? Obviously, you see Atlantean origins to that kind of construction. What can you tell us about uniting those two elements?
It is an interesting thing, isn't it, that you go around the world and you find pyramids not only in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, but you find them across Mexico and down to South America, across the Pacific, into Polynesia, into China. And one wonders, is there some kind of a connection going on? The connection that I have found, even though these similar structures are separated by many thousands of miles and sometimes by thousands of years, are again the mythic traditions associated with them. For example, in Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire, now known as Mexico City, there were a number of pyramidal structures, and at the very center of Tenochtitlan was the most important pyramid. And it was a kind of a conical pyramid. It rose in 5 levels. 5, by the way, was the sacred numeral in Atlantis, according to Plato. But that pyramid, the central pyramid, the most important one in the center of Tenochtitlan, was dedicated to Quetzalcoatl. He was considered the founding father not only of Tenochtitlan, but also the Aztec Empire, the Aztec people. He came from Aztlan. And the story with Quetzalcoatl, or the feathered serpent, was that he was this tall, fair-haired man who arrived with his family and in the retinue of a number of so-called sorcerers who possessed all this high magic, in other words, technology. And they were the ones that created this structure, this pyramidal structure, after a great flood had destroyed Aztlan. Now, when you go to the other side of the world, again to Egypt, I talked before about the Field of Reeds, Saqqara Aru, the story of the founding of the Great Pyramid is associated with the god Thoth, also known as Thoth. And he had with him the emerald tablets. After he left Saqqara Aru, the Field of Reeds, the emerald tablets contained all the wisdom of the world. And the story of the creation of the Great Pyramid was that Thoth arrived at the Nile Delta and spoke these words off of the emerald tablet. And because he spoke these words, the Great Pyramid and all the high civilization of dynastic Egypt flourished and came into existence. The original figure associated with the Great Pyramid was Thoth, or Thoth. So here you have these combination of myths, similar structures, and they seem to point to, again, some previous knowledge as inscribed on the emerald tablet. So by him speaking these so-called magic words, in other words, the technological wherewithal to create something like the Great Pyramid had been preserved and had been arrived at some former higher civilization. You see this in so many parts of the world. This isn't to say that every single pyramid on Earth is connected with a flood legend, but many are, a great many are, and in different parts of the world. If you go down to South America, the same story is told, only it's associated with Contiki Viracocha, or sea foam again described as a fair-haired, this time fair-complected, this time a red-haired culture bearer who comes after a great flood and establishes Andean civilization. You go out through the Pacific, and there you find Maui, who's also described as red-haired, interestingly enough, amongst people who are black-haired people, creating, again, the basis for what they call the Ahu, or these great platforms that rose in pyramidal levels on the island of Tahiti. That's remarkable.
Well, since you're mentioning the Pacific now, let's get to Lemuria a little bit. You've written about that too, and that, of course, for people who don't follow this as closely as we do, Lemuria preceded Atlantis as an ancient culture or civilization, according to esoteric sources. How do you tie all of these together?
Well, I think it's important for our listeners to understand that we live on a very dynamic planet filled with a great deal of climatic and geological change. And it's only natural that civilizations which flourished a long time ago would have been subject to these geological and climatological changes. So to find more than one civilization that has gone under the sea or has been destroyed through natural catastrophes is not that unusual. Yes, Lemuria did exist. The traditions, again, in the Americas, across the Pacific, and in Asia, make a very strong case for this high culture which preceded Atlantis and was totally different. If the Atlanteans were very much like modern-day Americans with all their high technology, the ancient Lemurians were more reminiscent of today's Tibetan Buddhists, whose emphasis is not on materialism or technology, but on the cultivation of the human soul. And in this regard, the Lemurians really were very successful and more successful if in terms of longer life. The Lemurians made this very strong impact on the religious traditions and the high spirituality of Asia after their civilization also went the way of Atlantis, to the extent that it too was the victim of a natural catastrophe.
Well, some of the people who have been most strongly identified with, with all of these subjects, and particularly Lemuria, was James Churchward and Augustus Le Plongeon and Arthur Poznansky. What do we owe to folks like that, and how much of their work should we take seriously?
I think that the work of these men and others needs to be very seriously examined. Certainly, they've made mistakes. It's the nature of science, of course, to make conclusions which are later invalidated or built upon by other more recent discoveries. But their fundamental, more than their fundamental work, is valuable and is checked out over time. We could go, of course, through all three of these men. I don't know how much time we have left for that, but especially Colonel Churchward certainly devoted many decades of his life to a rational understanding of this lost civilization of Lemuria, which he called Mu. It had many different names. Lemuria is just its Roman name. Mu is probably more close to its original. So I highly regard Churchward's work, and certainly Le Plongeon, and certainly Poznansky.
Well, one other thing I wanted to touch on a little bit. We've got a few more minutes here. What about what's called epigraphic evidence, or some of the inscriptions and so forth that have been found in odd places? And I'm thinking about the work of people like Barry Fell, who wrote America BC, and I'm sure that's been an important part of what you followed in your magazine there.
Yes, very much so. These symbols are more suggestive, very suggestive, and I think they contribute to the body of evidence that we work with, but they are very subjective in their interpretation. Some of the most interesting, though, Doug, that I've ever seen are not too far from where I live, luckily, maybe about 200 miles away, in the southwestern corner of Minnesota. There's a place called Pipestone. And Pipestone has a huge collection of natural petroglyphs. There was this rock outcropping that apparently attracted early human beings to put these symbols. And many of them are very abstract, but there are some that are very specific. And I'm thinking this one series that you can see to this day, you can go out and see it yourself, which portrays the Native American story of the Great Flood, actually spells it out in ideograms. And that seems really very Atlantean. It's always a thrill to see how they portray the ancestors of their people escaping from this great natural catastrophe that destroyed the former lodge of their ancestors, this great island in the sea that was overwhelmed. They got on the back of a turtle, which took them to America, and hence that's the name of America. Turtle Island was named after their survival from the Great Flood on the back of this turtle. So it's that seems pretty unequivocal. That's a very interesting set of petroglyphs.
Well, Frank, we thank you very much. We've been talking with author, researcher Frank Joseph, editor of Ancient American Magazine. And for more on his many ideas and theories about the ancient past, we recommend his books, of course, and of course his articles in Atlantis Rising. And for more on all of this, check our website at atlantisrising.com. Frank's website, by the way, is ancientamerican.com. This is Doug Kenyon for Atlantis Rising Conversations.